Hello, hi, good afternoon. I'm Kalai Peresami. I'm calling on behalf of the Institute for Clinical Research here at the NIH KKM Malaysia. Welcome everyone to our new session of webinar series on COVID-19 vaccine. This is, of course, jointly organized by the Malaysian Society of Infection Control and Infectious Diseases, MyICID, and with the help of the Institute of Clinical Research at NIH. Now, thank you for joining us. We have several online social media platforms that you can also join in. We welcome healthcare professionals and all of those who are out there who are concerned about vaccines and wanting to gain some additional input on the rollout of the vaccines and questions that may be relevant for your understanding of vaccines. As usual, we provide a platform for you to ask these questions. And this is through the Slido app. I hope you all are familiar with the use of the Slido app. And you can basically post your questions there. And time permitting, we will try to have those answered. Now, we also provide CPD points, so please do register yourself online. And in case you have missed it, you can, at the end of the broadcast, again, put back your email address and you can submit this together for your CPD. Today is a privilege and honor to introduce my friend and a colleague, Dr. Benedict Sim. He is a renowned ID physician who in fact is in the front line of COVID hospital at Hospital Sungai Buloh. I'm sure you're very familiar with the hospital in dealing with COVID-19 patients. And Dr. Sim has been very upfront in the work of vaccines as well. They've come out with a guidance document together with many other ID physicians, pharmacists, public health specialists, and also those who have dealt with allergy and epidemiology to provide guidance to healthcare professionals and many others on the vaccines. Today, he will discuss on some of those issues pertaining to vaccines and also offer you some answers to your questions. As you know, our country has rolled out vaccines. We have started with the Pfizer vaccine for the last month, and the next phase of the vaccine will start soon in this month. Healthcare professionals have been in the forefront of COVID-19 pandemic, and here they were prioritized to receive the vaccines. And soon after that, of course, we had many others who were essential workers dealing with COVID-19, either in transportation, in the provision of testing, and also in the care of population with this disease. And so these priority groups have all benefited from the vaccines. We now look forward to the next rollout phase where others who have vulnerabilities and chronic diseases are prioritized to receive vaccines from the several portfolios. Vaccines offer us a way of managing the pandemic in your social circumstances, in your jobs, in how you move around in your residential area, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we bring together this idea of vaccines, both in the way we manage the transmission of this COVID-19 and how we mitigate against the symptomatic conditions of this disease, and how vaccines play a critical role in the control of COVID-19. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Benedict Sim to give you a briefing on this topic, and also to introduce to you the various other topics that will come along over this webinar series. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the session, and we do look forward to your questions. Dr. Benedict.
Thanks, Dr. Kalai. Yeah, I hope my screen can be seen now. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for spending your afternoon here. So my talk is the first out of a series of 5 webinars that will take place weekly. And today, what I'm doing is actually setting the stage for the subsequent weeks. So I will be concentrating on the efficacy of vaccines, and this very important question about why we need to move towards vaccines in controlling COVID-19. And then in the subsequent weeks, next week, coming up, we will have a group of patients whom all of us are understandably concerned about vaccination, which is the elderly and those under palliative care. And so we've got a panel of experts coming next week to address vaccination in that group of patients. Subsequently, the next session, 2 weeks from now, will be addressing side effects from the vaccines. We will leave allergies to the following week, because allergies is one of the side effects, but it happens to be needs its own space. So we have given that a week on its own. That will be on the 4th week. On the 3rd week, we'll be speaking about all the other side effects about the vaccines, and how does it what are the rates of side effects, how severe are they, and is it something that we should be concerned, or is it something that we can minimize? And in the final week, we'll be speaking about vaccines in pregnant women, and also some of the lessons that we have learned from our first phase of the rollout. As Dr. Kalai mentioned earlier, the first phase involved healthcare workers, and the first phase is almost completely done. And along the way, we have learned some lessons, and what are some of those lessons learned. I should mention right at the beginning about this disclaimer. I've given quite a few talks on vaccines, and in a couple of them, people have said that you didn't give us a disclaimer. You know, are you paid by any pharmaceutical company? Are you paid by the government? Are you paid by NIH to give this talk? I'm not paid by anybody to give this talk, and so it is a purely an academic exercise. Yeah. This will be what I will cover in the next maybe 40 minutes or so. The first question, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time addressing this question, which is, are vaccines really needed? Is COVID-19 just a hyped up disease by the media? Shouldn't we just let nature take its course? After all, our world has seen pandemics before and lived through it. Or isn't this just another flu-like disease? Shouldn't we just allow it to take its course? And then I will only after that will I be talking about the efficacy of the vaccines. I will be concentrating mainly on the Pfizer vaccine, simply because that's a vaccine which was rolled out first worldwide and also in our country, and that's the vaccine with the most data that has come out so far. And I will be showing a few slides on some of the other vaccines as well. And can it prevent against getting infected from COVID? As you know, so the vaccines are pretty effective in terms of preventing disease, COVID disease, but does it prevent somebody from getting infected with COVID? That was something that in the early trials, we didn't know the answer. Now there's some data that can shed light on it. And how long do the vaccines last? The third part of my talk, I'll be talking about who should we prioritize for the vaccines, and more important than this is just going to be a list, and there's evidence behind it. But behind that is actually why do we need to prioritize some people for the vaccines? Yeah, and finally, I will be sharing a few slides about the impact of variants of COVID-19. I will not be able to do this topic complete justice, because that will be a talk on its own, viral variants, and really this is a moving target. So if I were to talk about viral variants today versus what I'm going to say in a month later, may actually be very different, because there is a lot more data coming out about viral variants, and it is, as I mentioned, a moving target. So I will start the talk by actually bringing up things that have filled some of the headlines going around, and this is especially so, perhaps not so much in mainstream media, but we see this a lot coming out in social media. We all are familiar with some very prominent people in the past coming out to say that perhaps this COVID-19 is being hyped up too much, and it is just one of those things that we can just let it run its course and everything will be well. Okay, here we have a quote saying that if 80,000 people die from COVID, it will just be roughly equivalent to a bad flu season. In Western countries, flu comes every winter and it kills off thousands of people. And perhaps COVID is just another one of these diseases. And there are also quite a lot. I must use the word alarming videos that you would find on social media coming in, mentioning how these vaccines is a catastrophe, that it's a disaster. People who are apparently doctors around the world issuing dire warnings not to get the vaccine. You've got anti-vaxxers coming out with a series of videos, and then you've got videos that target the populace, and with a lot of claims like this. The vaccine doesn't provide immunity, doesn't eliminate the virus, doesn't prevent death, so why are you getting it? So some of us might be tempted to laugh off some of these claims that come out through the alternative media or through social media. But I've spoken to many people, I've given many talks around, and I've spoken to many people as well, and these are graduates, and these are some doctors themselves, and these are concerns that people really have within them, and so I think it is important to actually address some of these some of these questions head on. These are the most recent numbers that came out yesterday. In Malaysia, we have seen 353,000 notified to have COVID, out of which 1,300 have died, and that makes it about 0.37% of deaths. So every 100 people getting COVID, 0.37 or 0.4% of people die. The range of death is, of course, if you go by country, there's a wide range. On one end, you've got war-torn countries like Yemen having 1 out of every 5 people diagnosed with COVID dying. On the other hand, you have other countries which spoil the market and have a mortality rate of just 0.05%. A lot of this would have to do on who is being tested and how much testing is being done. And because we all know that the mortality rates are may be very small in young age, if it is a younger age group that get it. One slide on this, the case fatality rates. What I showed you was the case fatality rates, and what these case fatality rates actually do not tell us, what it misses out. The first thing is that reports of death will lag behind the cases, and that's because if you were to come to my hospital's ICU now, you will find that the ICUs are still full, and you've got patients who have been in ICU for 2 weeks. You've got patients who have been in ICU for more than 2 months, and these patients may not be able to survive their COVID. So they come out as a number for having contracted COVID, but the ultimate outcome of the disease hasn't taken place yet. So the death rate always lags behind the number of people who have COVID. Of course, if you're talking about a disease that's been going on for a year, then this number would not be very significant. The other issue of why the case fatality rates may not show it up is because sometimes deaths are classified differently. So if somebody has been in hospital for a long time, he has received a lot of steroids, he ended up being bed-bound because of severe COVID, and let's say he gets a bed sore, or he gets and he's still on high doses of immunosuppressants, steroid treatment. If they were to get they may have recovered from their COVID now, but later on they get a nosocomial infection or get some other complication from being bed-bound, and then that can lead to death later on in the disease, and that may not be classified as COVID death. Of course, you got people who have died who were never tested for COVID because it was never suspected that they had COVID, mainly, yeah. And of course, there are patients that actually were discharged home and actually succumbed at home. and were never brought back to the hospital. And so this may not be classified as COVID deaths as well. They are indirect causes of death. And this is something that I'll be showing more data later on. So this term collateral damage comes about because, for example, my hospital Sungai Buloh, is a full COVID hospital right now, and prior to February or March 2020, it was a very busy hospital. It was a 900-bedded hospital, and we had patients coming in, neurosurgical patients coming in, patients with dengue, with HIV, who need plastic surgery, who need other surgeries. They were all coming to hospitals. When Hospital Sungai Buloh converted to become a full COVID hospital, all these patients had to go elsewhere, and understandably, there will be some patients that actually disadvantaged simply because this whole COVID thing has taken up a lot of resources, taken out a lot of space, and they get left behind. Yeah? So and some of it has even resulted in death. So there are indirect causes of death due to this COVID outbreak. And it doesn't take into account the morbidity of COVID. That's another thing that I'll be elaborating more later on. So we talk about mortality from COVID, but there's also a substantial morbidity from COVID. Patients who actually get long-term side effects of long-term complications of COVID. And finally, it's when we talk about these numbers as 0.4% or 1% mortality rate, we are not looking at it from the perspective of a patient. And that's what I will try to do later on as well. I'm looking at it from the perspective of a patient. I think generally COVID-19 deaths are not reported unless you are like this guy who decides to call everything as a COVID death. So this is a slide that I quite frequently show in my talks. To start off my talks, these actually data from our own experience in Malaysia, the first 6,000 plus COVID patients in Malaysia who were hospitalized in the COVID hospitals. So if you start off with that number, about half of them actually had asymptomatic infection, the other half had symptoms. Out of those who had symptoms, 88% of them, just the symptoms were mild, basically they had a URTI. About 12% of them went on to get severe disease. Severe disease is defined as the patient needing oxygen. Once the patient needs oxygen, then there's a 62% chance of them actually eventually needing ICU care, whereas 37% of them need oxygen, but they eventually get discharged without needing ICU care. And out of those that actually go to ICU, these were the early days. Out of those who actually went to ICU, more than a third of them actually didn't make it out alive. Yeah. So the reason why I show this is because the death rate may be 0.4% if you start off from here. But if you find yourself in hospital and you are one of these 379 patients who actually get severe disease, then suddenly the 0.4% mortality doesn't mean anything anymore, because the mortality rate for patients who have reached this point is actually quite substantial. Yeah, so because of that, I'm saying that it's important to look from the patient's perspective as well. The other thing that the other perspective to look at it will also be from an age perspective. So a 0.4% mortality, it's very real if you are if you are below the age of 40, where the mortality rates are actually pretty low. Yeah, but once you cross into the next decade of life and the subsequent decades of life, then you can see that the mortality rates start to climb, escalate quite quickly. Yeah, so if you are in your sixth decade of life, below the age of 60, then for every 100, so you have a party with 100 of your classmates, and all 100 get COVID, 2 of them will not make it out alive. Yeah, and if you move down, then in the next bracket of age bracket, you get 5 to 6% not making it out alive. 1 in 8 in the 8th decade of life will succumb to the disease. Above the age of 80, the mortality is like 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5 patients will succumb to the illness. this is the other thing that I wanted to point out. I'm surprised that this report didn't get that much headlines. This is where I mentioned about deaths being indirect deaths being COVID leading to they may not be classified as COVID deaths because, for example, if you look at this, this report came out on the 10th of February, and they were homing in on the statistics in Sabah. And so if you look at the death rates a year before, in the last quarter of 2019, there were 2,800 deaths. In 2020, it was 3,700 deaths, which was a 30% rise. As we all know, Sabah saw a severe COVID outbreak in the last 3 months of the calendar year last year. But if you look at the number of certified COVID deaths, it was 252. But the excess deaths were actually much more than 252. So there were people that died, perhaps were not tested for COVID or were missed that they had COVID, or perhaps they were just too scared to come to hospitals and they had heart attacks or they had strokes or they had cancers, and they actually chose to not to present to hospitals, or hospitals couldn't take them in. The excess deaths are actually much more than the COVID deaths, and that's not just the case in our own country. This report just came out earlier in the week. If you look at the excess deaths in the US, so they looked at from the beginning of March until the end of the year last year, and they've got data that goes back several years. So they can tell you how many people are expected to die in the US in 2020 based on the last 5 years data. Yeah. So they look at the trend over the last 5 years, but these were the observed deaths, and so the excess deaths were actually 500 over 1,000, out of which about 370,000 were directly due to COVID. But so about 72% of them, they actually said it was due to COVID, and the remainder fell into other categories. But we can probably surmise that they were indirect causes of COVID deaths as well. Yeah, and the same report actually showed that with that number of people dying from COVID, this is until 2021, it actually rivals, at least in the US, it actually rivals. So you've got influenza pandemics that have hit the world. You've got the Spanish flu 100 years ago, and then you've got the Hong Kong flu and all that that have emerged over the years. But if you look at the mortality rates, they pale behind, perhaps unless we consider the Spanish flu way back 100 years ago. That was the last time we saw that many deaths happening due to one respiratory outbreak. Okay, so these were the deaths in the US for 2020, as I mentioned. So you got 5 years data. So every year it's like 2.7 million, 2.7, 2.8, 2.8, 2.8 million. Suddenly you got 3.3 million deaths. And I highlighted a few other deaths that have increased significantly. Heart disease, unintentional injuries, strokes, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, kidney disease. All of this increased substantially in the year where there was COVID as well. So perhaps there were patients with heart disease, with strokes, with diabetes, with kidney disease, who actually perhaps contracted COVID earlier on, and that led to many more deaths in that category of patients later on, or perhaps they were not tested for COVID. I also want to make the case that beyond mortalities, that we should also look at patients who actually get severe disease. Severe disease here is defined as those that actually need oxygen. And if we look at it in our own local Malaysian data, this is again, it goes by age group. So if you are 40 and below, about 1+% of people actually require oxygen. So for every 100 people below the age of 40, if you get COVID, maybe only one person will need oxygen. But once you reach the age of 50s to 60s, then it's 8 in 100 who need oxygen. Once you reach above 70, it's quarter of the patients who contract COVID, you need oxygen. Also depends on whether you've got comorbidities. And all of this is important when we later talk about which are the priority groups that should get the vaccines first. Yeah. So as you have comorbidities, you get a much higher chance of getting severe COVID. And these are some of the comorbidities that we were talking about: hypertension, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and all that. These are some of the complications that can occur in COVID-19. And if your eyesight is as poor as mine, I've blown it up here. So you've got post-intensive care syndrome, venous thromboembolisms, cardiovascular complications, acute kidney injuries, and those were all a high likelihood. Then you've got neurological complications. So the list, and these conditions aren't anything to laugh at. They're actually fairly severe complications. This report came out again not too long ago from the UK. They looked at almost 87,000 people who were hospitalized with COVID, and they actually compared it to a control group. Okay, the control group. So it was a control for baseline characteristics of age and sex and ethnicity and all that. And they found that patients with COVID-19, these were control groups of people who were admitted into hospital but without COVID-19. And you find that eventually, when they actually called them up later on, how many of them had died? 12.3% of patients COVID. This was after they left hospital. These were not hospital deaths. This was after leaving hospital. Eventually, up to 12.3% of them succumbed, died by the time they received the phone call, as compared to 1.7% of them in the control group. The readmission rate for people with who were hospitalized for COVID was 30%, as compared to the control group being 10%. And if you look at all the events, sorry, I just realized I should turn on the laser pointer. So if you look at the complications, so you've got major adverse cardiovascular events in the COVID group being much higher than in control groups, and patients with newly diagnosed adverse cardiovascular events, whether it's heart failure or whether it's heart attacks or whether it's strokes, they are much higher compared to the control group. So patients with COVID, even if they survive COVID, but they happen to get severe COVID, many of them actually get complications that never leave them back to their normal selves again. This is another two studies came out. This one just shows you that up to 6 months later, a substantial amount of them actually still have symptoms of COVID after being discharged. And these are some of their symptoms: cognitive impairment. Out of 177 people, 61 had still had cognitive impairment, 21 had dysfunctional breathing, 33 of them had CT scan showed fibrotic lesions, psychiatric symptoms. Well, 60 of them actually had no symptoms. Yeah? So this was 4 months later after they were hospitalized. Is COVID just a bad flu? This paper tries to answer it. This one compares COVID-19 and seasonal influenza. So if you look at the seasonal influenza and COVID-19 outcomes here, in terms of death, the hazard ratio for COVID-19 is 5 times higher, mechanical ventilation 4 times higher, intensive care maybe 2.5 times higher. We have a lot more excess outcomes per 100 patients who are hospitalized with COVID-19, 16 more deaths, 11 more mechanical ventilations, 20 more ICU admissions. The length of stay is increased, and this is by pictorial looking at, this is until 2 months after getting hospitalized for COVID or seasonal influenza, and you can see the lines really diverge in terms of deaths, in terms of ventilator use, in terms of admissions into ICU. So the resources that they take up are much higher, and it leads to much poorer outcomes compared to influenza. This is another way of looking at it. Another study, and these are the rates of this one. If the lines are to the right this line of unity, then it is more the relative risk of getting ARDS with COVID is that much time more compared to influenza, pneumothoraces are more, DICs are more, acute myocarditis is more, intracranial hemorrhages are more, dialysis is more, okay? And again, the length of stay is increased. ICU admissions are 35% versus 17%, in hospital mortality 21% versus 4%. Okay? And this one just came out this morning, actually. These are actually 6-month neurological and psychiatric outcomes. So you've got here hundreds of thousands of survivors of COVID, and they look back 6 months later, and this is comparing COVID together with other respiratory tract infections, so includes pneumonias, includes influenzas, and you find that even up to 6 months, patients with COVID have more intracranial hemorrhage, more ischemic strokes, more nerve root problems, and myoneural junction and muscle disease. These are for patients who are hospitalized for COVID. So obviously, I think COVID is much more significant than influenza, but influenza sort of like gives you a picture of or at least a baseline for what to compare COVID with. I just put in this one slide. There are also people that comment that perhaps we should just let COVID run its natural course, when we get herd immunity through the natural infection way. Many of you would have heard of this city of Manaus. Manaus is in the upper reaches of the Amazon River, and it is a city by itself. It's like 2 million inhabitants. It was badly hit by COVID in the middle of last year. We were seeing up to 70 deaths every day. By the way, these are the mass graves that they had to dig for Manaus when it hit its peak in the middle of last year. By the time September came, from studies they looked at the blood bank from blood donor samples, and they concluded that 70% of the people in Manaus actually already contracted COVID. And so by the end of the year, they decided that they did not need any more SOPs, they didn't need any more lockdowns. So many people had already gotten the disease, and so no more restrictions were needed, masks were not needed, and so they released all the restrictions. By January, the death rates in Manaus had climbed even higher than in the year before. Yeah, even in a population that was supposedly having gone through natural infection. And Manaus was also the sort of like the nidus for Brazil. Eventually, what happened in Manaus reached the rest of Brazil, and up to a few weeks ago, we were reading headlines that Brazil was actually probably one of the worst hit countries in the whole world when it came to COVID. So with that background on what happens if we let COVID run its course, and that we trivialize COVID, I bring you to this question: is whether the vaccines that we have now, whether they are effective for COVID. By now, many of you would have heard on the trial reports of COVID. So I like to stress that the numbers involved in this. So this is the data from the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and they had 20,000 in each arm. Okay, so half of the people got placebo, half of the people got the vaccine. The patients obviously didn't know what they were receiving, and the doctors didn't know what they were. All we knew is that they were given a code, and that the code will be what they call it, decoded later on to know whether they actually had the vaccine or the placebo. Yeah? And so what happened is that after 2 weeks, the graphs started to split up, and when later on, when they reached 170 cases, they found that they unblinded the trial, and they found that 162 of the 170 who contracted COVID actually received the placebo, and 8 of them received the COVID vaccine. So it is still possible to get COVID after you receive the vaccine. 8 people did out of 18,000 people over here, whereas 162 out of 18,000 people in the placebo arm contracted COVID. Yeah? So based on this, we come to the vaccine efficacy of 95%. I think it is important to understand these numbers because many in the public are confused, and people are actually saying 95% efficacy means 5% of the population after getting vaccinated will still get COVID, or 5% will get severe disease. No, that's not the case. Yeah? It's just that your likelihood of getting COVID drops by 20 times. Yeah? If you have received the COVID versus somebody who has not received the vaccine yet. This was population data that came out of Israel. So in the initial clinical trial of Pfizer, we're talking about 40,000 people. Here you're talking about the first million people who received the vaccine, 600,000 who received the vaccine versus the next 600,000 who had yet to receive the vaccine. So this was done in Israel. And if you find, again, after 2 weeks, the lines start to move away from each other. Here they looked at different outcomes. They look at documented COVID infection. So were people actually being protected from being infected with COVID? Were they protected from getting symptomatic COVID? Were they protected from hospitalization, protected from severe COVID, or protected from deaths due to COVID? And if you see all of this, there's here the orange line is those who didn't, who had not gotten the vaccine yet, and the blue line is those who were vaccinated. And if you look, there was a significant difference starting from 2 weeks after getting the vaccines across the board, whether it's deaths. Of course, there's a huge benefit getting the vaccine, severe disease, huge benefit, but also for hospitalization, symptomatic disease, and even contracting COVID itself. Okay, and when they looked at these numbers, they found that it was actually 90% efficacy in terms of protecting you from actually contracting COVID. This is data that came out from the US in the mortality and morbidity review, weekly review. And so they looked among healthcare workers. Okay, and so you know, it was like 116,000 person days they looked at. And so in the unvaccinated group, there were 1.38 cases of COVID for every 1,000 person days. And those who are partially immunized, that come down. Partially immunized, that means have not gotten the 2 doses of the vaccine, or before the 2 weeks were up after getting the 2nd dose of the vaccine, and there was some 80% vaccine effectiveness there. Okay, and after being fully immunized, more than 14 days after getting the 2nd dose, there was a 90% vaccine effectiveness. So this is real life data. This is not clinical trials. So this is effectiveness data. This is a study in, I think, Scotland. Yeah, Scotland, they actually showed that, again, it was among healthcare workers, and very wordy here. There were no nice graphs that I could cut out and paste, but basically what it showed was actually household members of vaccinated healthcare workers had a lower risk of COVID compared to household members of unvaccinated healthcare workers. And you know, it was like 9.4 versus 5.9. Okay, and then they went to look at other things, hospitalization and all that kind of thing. So it didn't just protect the healthcare worker; it protected the household members. You know, the elderly mother, the elderly father, the children of the healthcare worker. Again, this is showing that those who are not vaccinated, this is the rates of among the employees. These were the rates of getting COVID. This was the rates after they were partially vaccinated. This was the rates once they were fully vaccinated. And so this was in the US when the vaccination program started in the middle of December. This gray lines here are what the expected rates were going to be if there was no, looking at the trends of COVID going up during that time, what would have happened if there was no vaccine given. Okay, and these white dots actually show what actually did happen. Okay, blue line actually tells us when the 2 weeks after the vaccines were reached, and the rates really dropped. Okay, which I thought was important to highlight here. It is understandable that once people get the vaccines, that they let their hair down, or they do away with some of the precautions, and it was worrying enough for actually issue this statement that stronger warnings are actually needed to curb social vaccination. Because what was happening was that these people, after being vaccinated, they were actually having meals together and taking off the mask. And I think we saw some of that happening even among Malaysian healthcare workers as well. It is understandable, people have been in lockdown, people have had to follow SOPs for a long time, and some people after getting the vaccine felt that it was they could take their chances. No, the vaccine after you get the 2 doses, and even after the second dose, it's 2 weeks later. So all in, we are talking about, like, if you get the Pfizer vaccine, it's probably like 6 weeks after the start of your first jab. So don't, you still need to do SOPs at least for the short, for the immediate period after vaccination. This one again just came out just a few days ago, and many of you would have seen this report because it's made its way into the mainstream press as well, where the Pfizer, those who were vaccinated in a clinical trial, those 40,000 people, they followed them up, and 6 months later, the rates of protection were still 90%. Yeah, so the efficacy of the vaccines held even up to 6 months after getting the vaccines. So so just summary, the vaccines do 3 levels of protection. They protect the person who is being vaccinated. I showed you from the Scotland study that it also protects your family members who are vaccinated. And of course, ideally, we would all like to see one day is actually herd immunity happening, where enough people are vaccinated in society, so that those who for some reason are unable to be vaccinated, maybe they were allergic to the vaccines, or for some reason they missed out on the vaccines, at least they will be surrounded by people who are vaccinated, and through that way the RO just drops dramatically, and then we see an end to this problem. Of course, Pfizer is not the only vaccine. You have heard news reports that we are bringing in AstraZeneca. Sinovac is already in the country, and there's CanSino that will also be brought in. CanSino is unique because it only needs 1 dose. Okay, I will spend a bit of a few slides on these other vaccines. This is the CanSino data. This is in the phase 2 trial. This adenovirus 5 vector. So the genes coding for the spike protein is it's latched on to this adenovirus 5, which is human beings, and they tried with 2 doses, and that versus placebo, and they looked at the response after 28 days, and this was the baseline data, and the baseline data was basically the same. If you look at percentages, the male-female distribution was the same, age was the same, BMI was the same, and the baseline antibody levels were all the same. And when you look at if you compare the geometric mean titers of antibodies for those who had, these were the 2 doses of the vaccine, they were basically the same. The response were not statistically significant, but they were different compared to placebo, and this was after day 28. Yeah, and this was neutralizing antibodies for the live COVID virus. This was a pseudo COVID virus, whereby they put the spike protein on another virus, and they said the vaccine can work just as well, and the 2 different doses worked just as well as each other, but much better than placebo. There's also Sinovac vaccine. There's some concern about Sinovac vaccine, whether it can be licensed to be used in patients 60 years and above. So I just picked out some of the experiences from worldwide. In Chile, they are using it. It was concluded that the vaccine was well tolerated, induces a response, humoral response in 60 years and older, supporting the use of vaccine in that population. Indonesia, they had some limited data. Turkey, they're also vaccinating the elderly. So is Hong Kong. They feel that the benefit outweighs the risk. And at the moment, the data is not out yet for Thailand. Based on phase 3 data, the vaccine is at least 50% protection against mild to severe COVID. Very mild to severe COVID, and then 83% protection from mild to severe COVID, 100% against severe COVID protection. And in those who are more than 60 years old, the vaccine does give a 51% protection. And so this was some of the data that we could gather now. So and they also looked at pharmacovigilance. I won't go through this the details, but basically the vaccine was found to be actually very safe in patients who are above the age of 60. So in Brazil, 55% of the people who are vaccinated are above the age of 60. In Turkey, is 80%. In Chile, is 1/3 of them who are vaccinated above the age of 60. So altogether, you've got like 21 million people around the world who have already received the Sinovac vaccine above the age of 60. Just one slide on AstraZeneca in terms of the efficacy. I won't be talking about the side effects of this vaccine because that will be covered by the subsequent weeks webinars. Yeah, but in terms of the efficacy, this AstraZeneca vaccine made the headlines because it was sort of like a not-for-profit vaccine, and it didn't need any special refrigeration to be stored. So it sounded like the people's vaccine, and it was also found that it was 70% efficacious, and there was a small group of people who actually received, about 2,000 people out of the 7,000 people who actually got a wrong dose the first time around, and they seem to have been better protected. They seem to have been better protected compared to those who received the full doses, but the confidence intervals lapsed, so it may not be significant. But overall, there was a 70% protection against getting symptomatic COVID, and when it came to getting severe COVID, the protection was very, very good. Yeah, I think there were 10 people that were hospitalized. I think 2 people died, and all of those who were hospitalized and died were those that received placebo. So I've showed this slide earlier talking about so who should be prioritized for the vaccine. It is very obvious that the older a person is, the higher the more need for them to get vaccinated, because they are more likely to succumb from the disease, they are more likely to fear disease, okay, and those with diabetes. Yeah? So based on this, this is what the guidelines will look. There will be guidelines coming out very soon, and this is what the guidelines includes. So people who are immunocompromised, people, transplant recipients, hematological malignancies, people with cancers, with autoimmune diseases, on systemic steroids, immunosuppressed patients, a subgroup of HIV patients, splenectomized patients, and patients with chronic diseases, chronic heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease, strokes, TIAs, Down syndrome, chronic respiratory illness, okay, COPD, severe asthma, bronchiectasis, lung fibrosis, and then diabetes patients, patients who are obese. The more obese you are, the higher your risk of getting severe disease. Patients with severe mental illness. So these are the groups that will be prioritized, and this was actually adapted from the Green Book from the Public Health England handbook. And finally, a few slides on COVID-19 variants. What is a variant? A variant is a COVID-19 strain earns the title of being a variant of concern if it has been demonstrated to cause increase in transmission or in virulence or a change in the clinical presentation, or it escapes from immunity that was derived from natural infection, for example, the P1 infection and the P1 variant that affected Manaus in Brazil, or there's a decreased effectiveness in public health or clinical countermeasures. So anything that sabotage our capability of dealing with COVID will be, if that variant causes it, then it becomes a variant of concern. Okay, whether the effectiveness in terms of vaccination, in terms of treatment, the current treatment that we're giving, or in terms of some variants also may elude certain testing kits as well. So these are some of the potential consequences of emerging variants. We've got B117, B1351. This was discovered in the UK. This was discovered in South Africa, and both of them have led to increased transmission. B117 increased certain diagnostic tests. B117 can elude it, although PCS, if it targets multiple targets, not the rapid PCRs, but the conventional PCRs can. If there's decreased susceptibility to monoclonal antibodies, and both have shown decreased susceptibility, or convalescent plasma. If it can evade natural or vaccine immunity, and that has been shown for B1531 strain from South Africa, and as I mentioned, the P1 variant seems to evade natural acquired immunity. So these are some of the variants that people have got eyes on. There are a lot of other variants as well. These three are by far the biggest headache. So they have got to know whether a variant is of concern or not. They've got this checkerboard type of thing, depending on the indicator, as I mentioned earlier, the transmissibility, the severity, the susceptibility, and all that. So they've got a traffic light system to know whether it is very serious or whether it is warrants attention, or whether it's not really different from the what we normally see. Okay, so for example, D1 variant, and the main thing that is of concern is that the vaccine-derived immunity may not be seen very well with this variant. So of the potential implications for at least the vaccine, because this is the most the best studied vaccine so far. For the UK variant, it seems that the Pfizer vaccine will still work very well, but not so much in the case of the South African variant, the 1351, although it does show that it still works against preventing severe disease. Okay, at least sorry, this is the Pfizer one, is still, although there's a reduction in the neutralization activity, but those who were vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine were much less likely to get severe disease, even though it didn't protect them that symptomatic disease. So the impact of these vaccines efficacy in real-world setting with these variants, not quite known. Like I said earlier, this is a moving target. So that brings me up to my last slide. In summary, I just wanted to reiterate, don't be fooled by looking at case fatality rates, because there are many things that the case fatality rates do not show us, and especially so it doesn't talk about the morbidity from COVID, and it doesn't look at COVID from the perspective of somebody who actually has contracted COVID. Naturally, allowing COVID to run its course doesn't sound like a good idea at all. The disease can come, and it can come again in different waves, and it really looks like we do need something else apart from the current public health interventions to give us a hope of normalizing things again. The current vaccines are effective against death, are effective against severe disease, and there's already data now that show that they're up to 90% effective against transmission of COVID as well. We need to prioritize the elderly, we need to prioritize those with comorbidities, because don't protect them first, then the hospitals will continue to be, we will continue to see the worst of COVID-19, which is death and severe disease. It's important to know that we are not out of the woods yet, despite being vaccinated. Even after vaccines, it takes up to 6 weeks for the vaccines to fully work, the double dose vaccines, and even then there's still a 10% chance of contracting COVID. So while COVID does the vaccines do protect you against getting COVID, it is not a foolproof method. Yeah? And viral variants are of concern, but do seem to protect against severe disease. So in terms of what really counts, the vaccines, even though the viral variants are of concern, but the vaccines do seem to work preventing severe disease or preventing death. Okay, with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Ben. Thank you so much for that. I tremendously enjoyed what you said, and I know a lot of facts and figures were displayed, but it gave clarity to the understanding of the COVID situation, the at-risk groups, and those who are, sometimes fixated on case fatality rate, to actually analyze the data showing as you age, or if you're hospitalized with symptoms, your mortality risk is much higher. And also the way the vaccine has been targeted to certain variants, and how the efficacy data is used to determine some of those issues pertaining to vaccination. I think there's some interest, of course, in wanting to ask specific questions on vaccines and by brand. I'm just going to start answering, getting some questions to you and see whether we can get it rolling. The first question that I would like to bring up is this one here. Should we be concerned about China vaccine only offering 50% efficacy versus Pfizer, especially for elders above 65 with comorbids? Thank you. Could you have a look at that rather than addressing the brand? Perhaps just offer your insight into efficacies that is different among the different platforms.
So I think when we look at the vaccine efficacy, as I mentioned earlier, there are different ways of measuring the efficacy, and what we are most interested in, especially in that age group, is can it prevent death? Can it prevent severe disease? And that is what I think we should be most concerned about. And for that, I think that all the vaccines have shown to have comparable efficacy. Yes, there may be some differences between the vaccines, and that's because if you look at how the trials are carried out as well, there are differences in the methodology, but really they all seem to give protection against death and severe disease, which is, I think, the most important outcome of these vaccines. We shouldn't, I think, also be spoiled by that the vaccine is only worthwhile getting if it is 90% protective. All of us, we know that influenza vaccines, influenza is a much milder disease, and yet we know that in a subgroup of patients, influenza can be a deadly disease. Influenza vaccine efficacy never reaches anywhere near 90%. Every year in the vaccines that come out. In fact, reaching 60% is considered a very, very good vaccine year already. So I think as long as it can give us some amount of protection against getting severe disease, I think that's something that we should really be very thankful about. And it works very strategically because there's I think it's much more important for many people to get a vaccine that is easily available rather than just everybody wanting to get just one vaccine which is difficult to get, but may show to have a bit better efficacy. And so I wouldn't be overly concerned about the differences in the efficacy.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ben. I think, yeah, I concur with that because I know that the vaccine, as you illustrated through your case examples of admission and mortality, the primary aim of the vaccine is to mitigate against severe form of the COVID and certainly death from hospitalization related problems. And the availability of vaccine, as you correctly pointed out, in the rollout, we need more people to be vaccinated to achieve a certain level of mitigation against community level disease situation. Right, I'm going to bring up another question. This is quite popular here too. Right, so given that the patients are concerned about vaccine side effects, how are clinicians able to counsel them about these doubts? I think on this question, there are things that we know that any vaccine does offer local side effects and some systemic side effects. Perhaps maybe you want to address, the larger concern about other side effects rather than what is known to expect from any vaccination. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, I won't go into the details of the side effects because I think this will be covered in the subsequent webinars. But I think that the first thing is, so if everybody listening is a healthcare worker, I think the first thing that is important for us to realize, I've realized it to the many talks that I've given and to talking to the public, is that it is understandable why people out there have a lot of concern. When it comes to COVID-19, the scientific evidence has moved so quickly. Even COVID-19 itself, there are people who have been left behind and didn't realize what was happening around them. And it is understandable that there's a lot of fear, a lot of doubt, a lot of mistrust happening. And the one thing I've learned that we shouldn't do is to laugh off people's concern, to laugh off the concerns about side effects to the vaccines. The vaccines have got side effects. I think if anybody tells you that no, there are absolutely no side effects from my vaccine, he's lying and you shouldn't trust him. The vaccines have got side effects, and most of the side effects are very mild, and most of the side effects have been known, have been described. Some people bring up theoretical side effects. What if 2 years later I get cancer, or 5 years later I get an autoimmune disease? I think that one we know that most vaccine side effects occur in the immediate days to weeks after the vaccines, and now we've got like hundreds of millions of people who have been vaccinated already, and so there's strength in the numbers of people, and many weeks or even months have gone by, and we are not seeing any such disturbing signals. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that the fears that people have, and see what exactly they are concerned about, and try to use, if we do know of some of these scientific facts, then it is important to actually show them how were the trials carried out, what does it mean by 95% efficacy, how do they study vaccine side effects, the pharmacovigilance part of it, which I think will be mentioned about in the series, how careful people are. I think making headlines around the world now is the AstraZeneca vaccine, and I think in the last couple of days, we have heard how they have conclusively, or at least some bodies have said that these unusual blood clots are linked to the vaccines, and I think it is good that the pharmacovigilance, that everybody is actually careful to observe what is happening, and that there's no, in terms of cover-up or a conspiracy, that even if somebody gets side effects, they're not going to tell us, what the government is going to hush it up, or the companies will hush it up, or the World Health Organization won't tell us about it. No, I think there's a lot of openness in terms of it is right to be concerned about these vaccines, but at the moment it looks like it's stacked heavily in terms of the benefits of the vaccine they very much outweigh the risk of getting the vaccine. Yeah? So I think it is important to be concerned about the side effects, but not be overly concerned because I think the benefits of the vaccine definitely outweigh the risk in a massive way.
Right. Thanks for that. Yeah, I agree on that point, Dr. Ben, that we need to look into the broader perspective too. And in the issue of side effects, there'll be other webinars. We will come back with better detail and clarity. And I know some of the questions are basically towards those issues, and perhaps it'd be better to have that webinar to be the better platform to answer specifically for some of those matters. I'd like to bring you to the next question. I'd like to ask why immune response to COVID-19 through natural infection is often not persistent, or is it persistent? And according to some literature, it appears to fade away after about 90 days. What's your view on this, Dr. Ben?
Right. The immune system is actually a very complex system, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an immunologist, and I don't claim to know this extremely well. But what happens is that when we talk about protection against COVID, it is not just a matter of antibodies. It also matters which type of antibodies it is. So if you noticed in some of the earlier slides, I mentioned about neutralizing antibodies. So having antibodies to infection doesn't mean anything if the antibodies cannot neutralize the virus. So when we read papers on this, we look, are they talking about neutralizing antibodies? How are the antibodies being measured? And the other
who has asked the question?
Sorry, yeah. The other question is, the other thing to look at is also, that's just part of the immune system. Then you've also got the cell-mediated immunity as well. So the cell-mediated immunity brings about the memory aspect of the immune system. So just because even if your antibody levels do drop, but your body has got the cell-mediated immunity is intact, then it can still respond well to the subsequent insult. And that's what many of these vaccines are trying to replicate, stimulate the memory cells as well. And I think there are many different studies that look at how long these antibodies last in our body. I think many other studies show that it lasts for more than 6 months, and 6 months and counting. You know, so it really depends on which study we are looking at. The 2-month cutoff, I think, is more of if I had COVID before, when when can I receive my vaccine again, or when should I receive my vaccine again? And we have put it arbitrarily as 3 months, because in the first 3 months at least we know people are generally protected from natural infection.
Yeah, thank you for that again, Dr. Ben. This is a very interesting question. Perhaps a very quick answer on this. Does the COVID vaccine cause false positive for your rapid test kit antibody? And what about the attenuated virus causing a positive response to the PCR antigen test? What's your view on this?
The RTK antibody, yes, it will pick up your antibodies if your COVID vaccine is genuine, and if the COVID vaccine did work in you, then yes, your RTK antibody will pick it up if it is a good kit, but it wouldn't cause a false positive PCR, because it codes codes for the spike protein, and that's not adequate to pick up the panel of genes that are detected by the PCR test. So you will not get a false positive PCR after your COVID vaccine. If your PCR becomes positive and is truly positive, means you are one of the unlucky people who, despite vaccination, still contracted COVID.
Yeah, so thank you again. Yeah, there's been some reported cases, of course, where people do become PCR positive despite offering a vaccination history even after it being completed. Perhaps I could add a little bit on that discussion, Dr. Ben. As you know, most of the vaccines are primed to achieve a certain efficacy level beyond a certain number of days post-vaccination. And therefore, until one achieves the sort of maximum efficacy level, they're still likely to be infected sometimes, and the symptoms may be very mild to non-existent. And therefore, a PCR test at that point in time may turn out to be positive. But still, the vaccine is protecting that individual. That is important. As far as whether the person may continue to be transmitting the virus or so, that is being investigated, of course. Studies showed that the vaccine, in fact, dampens the viral load, and therefore it offers the benefit of reduction in transmission as well. So that is the sort of evidence is coming across, but of course this needs a further validation through a bigger population study. So that is something we all look forward to. The next question, Dr. Ben, is that they would like to know the effectiveness of vaccine in special population, particularly in geriatrics and those with medical comorbidities.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say I've actually got a slide on this, and I seem to have forgotten to put it up. Yes, I think they actually looked into this. I think again the Israeli group, they actually looked into it, and they had different cutoffs for people below below 65 and above 65, people with comorbidities and people with a different number of comorbidities, and how it was protective, and across the board the efficacy, regardless of age group, regardless of comorbidities, regardless of BMI, it was all 80-90% efficacy. Thanks for that question. I actually forgot to insert that slide. I must find it and put it in for my next talk as well. Yeah, so it is very efficacious across the board, across all populations. Yeah.
Okay, I think you covered this question. Is there any truth that there are lots of cover-up stories to dupe the public into believing vaccination is the only way to end the COVID-19 pandemic? I think you did touch on those anecdotal kind of reference points, some articles, of course, coming from authorities that appear credible, as well as analytics that are hinting to some form of cover-up stories. What's your personal view on this, and what is the evidence against this?
I think so there are countries that have managed to curb COVID-19 without having the vaccine yet. You know, I think the well-known examples would be, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan. They never had the vaccine then, but they managed to curb COVID-19. But it came at a very and even in countries like Singapore now, they still don't allow big social gatherings. And the same goes for the places like Taiwan and all that. There's still a lot of emphasis on the public health interventions, and so there's still mask wearing, there's still SOPs to be followed and all that. And of course, if you can follow that completely, then actually you don't need the vaccine. But the vaccine makes it so much easier to reach that, because when you're talking about vaccine efficacy rates of such high, that thing, then it can help supplement a lot of these other both public health measures as well as individual, I'm doing a lot of testing and isolating of individuals. So all of this, I think they work together to, none of us want to see another MCO in our country if we can, this is one way of getting towards normalcy as early as possible. And so I think it does hold out a lot of hope from a public health point of view.
Okay, Dr. Ben. So this is again specific to a particular vaccine by name. So rather than addressing the particular vaccine, like here is mentioned Sinovac or Coronavac, I think there is often a packet insert, or these are the information that comes along with the vaccine. In the way it is to give practitioners some precautionary statements, some contraindications. We know, for example, anaphylaxis risk is a contraindication that has been added on to information. There's also a precautionary information given to those of certain age groups, certain medical conditions, diabetes, for example, that is uncontrolled. What is your view on this about how clinicians and infectious disease specialists like yourself, how do you work around this issue of trying to offer the vaccine at the same time to minimize the risk of any potential or precautionary action that you have to take?
Right. Yeah. So when it comes to looking at a drug or a vaccine's product inlet, I think it is obviously they can only claim to do what they have. The drug or the vaccine can only claim that it is effective in the population that it was studied in. Yeah. So in the clinical trials, if it was studied for this, then it is licensed for this. And so that's why I think those advisories come about. But in the real life setting, and especially when it comes to epidemics and pandemics, then there is necessity to look beyond what the official indications are for. And that is what many other countries have looked at as well, and to see whether there's any safety concerns. I think the concerns for at least the company is not so much about efficacy, but about the safety, because when you first start doing trials, you don't want to do your trials in very, very sickly people. You want to do your trials in healthy people so that, you face as little difficulties in interpreting the data. You get the data out as quickly as possible, and that is how Sinovac and most other companies would have done, and so it is understandable why the product inlet contains information like this. But we on the ground, I think we have to see whether the current evidence and the current experience from other countries as well, whether it is safe for us to extrapolate that information into other populations, and whether there's any specific concerns that we should be looking at. Yeah, and I think this is being discussed at a high level, and it looks likely that we will, based on data from other countries as well, and even the most well-known vaccine currently, the Pfizer vaccine, there are some usage that we have gone, which is beyond that of the product inlet as well. So there will be some room for us to actually suggest that it be used beyond its, those strict indications.
Okay, last couple of questions. I know there's so many interested, so many questions. As I've mentioned earlier, this webinar series essentially covers much of the clinical guidance that look at vaccine side effects and immunity level at different levels of this webinar. So today I'm going to give some special focus in relation to what Dr. Ben has mentioned in his talk earlier. So perhaps this question from Anonymous, is there any specific measures recommended for individuals with autoimmune disease, SLA for example, prior to vaccination? And is there any difference in terms of the vaccines, perhaps from its efficacy point of view or the side effect point of view with those with autoimmune disease? This is, I think, in the mind of many people, certainly. What's your take on this, Dr. Ben?
Right. Yeah, I think autoimmune diseases is something that many people were concerned about, especially with new technologies being involved in this vaccines, whether it's an mRNA platform or the viral vector platform that was used to deliver the vaccines in. It is understandable why people are concerned, especially people who already have autoimmune diseases. But at the moment, I think, like as I mentioned, the data, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people who have been vaccinated, and we are not seeing any worrying signals emerging from this. Many people are looking at it, and we do know that people with autoimmune diseases who are on immunosuppressants, immunomodulating drugs, they're at higher risk of getting COVID, and if they get COVID, they get severe COVID. If anything, we are actually suggesting that these immunocompromised or immunosuppressed individuals be actually at the forefront of getting the vaccine and not shy away from the vaccine. As I mentioned, I can't give you any assurances of 2-year data because it just doesn't exist, but based on several months data in terms of patient years, the numbers are really huge, and we are not seeing any abnormal signals based on this. There are also, there's not enough time being given among the different trials to show any differences between the vaccines. But really at the moment, generally, there does not seem to be any added concern for patients with autoimmune diseases.
Okay, let me see whether I can get this one thing here. Okay, so perhaps to put into context the many aspects of your talk today and your Q&A, maybe you could give us a summary point from your perspective, and also to many other healthcare practitioners out there. How do we move to encourage patients to consider accepting COVID-19 vaccine? We know it is still something that is rolled out free by the government. It still requires consent, and there is information offered before and during the process, and also that is monitoring during and after the process of being vaccinated, and there's opportunity to report any in the event of an unintended side effect. It is still available. So with all of those things factored in, how do we give confidence to patients to consider accepting COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, I think so for all of us individuals out there, if you are a healthcare provider, which I believe many of us are, I really think this is our challenge out there. There people are reading all kinds of things on social media, purportedly coming from doctors and from people who are questioning the role of vaccines and questioning the severity of COVID-19. I think we really need to go out there with the true picture and explain things well. All of us out there actually need to be advocates for the vaccine, because I think the vaccines, I think they are here now, they are coming in now, and we know the population that needs to be protected the most, the elderly, those with comorbidities, and it is worrying that there are probably not enough champions out there who are speaking up and encouraging them, giving them the assurance, giving them the confidence to actually take this vaccine. As I mentioned earlier, my parents are elderly. I've got my parents-in-law are elderly. I do understand the level of concern that people have out there for these vaccines, but really I can't imagine any of them getting COVID and coming into the hospital and having to go through what many of our patients have gone through, and many of you have seen as well. Yeah, I think the risk of the vaccines are there, but the risks are very, very small. The side effects of the vaccines are there. They are mostly mild side effects, but not getting the vaccine is a very bad idea for those people in the highest risk groups. And for that, I'm meaning those above the age of 60 and those with comorbidities, please come forward. Yeah. By the time the next phase comes, there'll be a lot more data out there to give us a lot more confidence, for people at lesser risk of the disease. But now, at phase 2, let's concentrate on getting people who need the vaccine the most to actually benefit from getting this vaccine. Yeah, I think I'm not sure how to make it any clearer, but we all really need to be champions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben, for spending with us time from your very busy schedule. I'm very certain that you are very much in demand, and certainly Hospital Sungai Buloh is very much proud of your presence and the work you have done, and so as all of us here at NIH. Now, I'd like to thank him personally, as well as on behalf of NIH for making time to share his experience and his expertise in this field. I also like to congratulate him in the provision of the clinical guidance and his teamwork for the rollout of the vaccine in the country. They have detailed on the use of the Pfizer vaccine as well as on the Sinovac vaccine. This will be the guideline that we'll bring it up for the practitioners. Now, next week, the topic will be on vaccinating elderly and those with comorbids and those under palliative care. Some of the questions that were raised during the webinar today can be addressed during that session. It will be conducted by Dr. Riza from HKL, as well as Dr. Richard Lim from Hospital Selayang. Both of them will offer their experience and expertise in this field. And the time will be on the same platform on the 14th of April, 3 p.m. onwards. We look forward to seeing you again. And on behalf of all of us here at the NIH and to Dr. Ben personally again, thank you very much for joining us this time. And we look forward to joining us again on the 14th. Thank you very much and have a good and pleasant day ahead.